How's it going today, guys? In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the month I spent in Ponce. I remember during my first trip to Puerto Rico when I made it to Ponce and I realized that there was just too much for me to do there and there's no way I could afford or justify spending any time there because I couldn't do the place and the cemetery justice with the funds that I had and the equipment that I had. So I spent all of my off season in between trip one and trip two really thinking about Ponce. And that was my biggest inspiration for coming back to the island. I wanted to go and stay at Ponce. So I even rented an apartment there for a month at the Villa del Carmen in that area. And it was really close to the ocean down there on the south coast. And I got the place for a month because I wanted to walk up and down every street in Ponce and I wanted to visit all the cemeteries there in depth. I didn't want to be rushed or hurried at all. So I made a lot of preparations for this trip. When I got there, I noticed at the apartment that I rented that they had a blender. So I went to the store and I bought pounds of blueberries and strawberries and raspberries and blackberries, and I filled the freezer there. And I also got a bunch of peanut butter so I could have a peanut butter and fruit smoothie every day while I was there in Ponce. And then every night I'd get dinner at Victor Polo's chicken stand that was right down the street. So that was part of my daily routine while I was there for a month. So I arrived in Ponce on a Friday afternoon, so I knew I had the weekend to kill before I went to the mayor's office and tried to request permission to film and photograph the cemeteries in the city. And this was going to be my strategy for Ponce and for the rest of my walks during my second trip. I was going to go just straight to the mayor's office and get permission. So that way I didn't have to worry about looking over my shoulders or getting ran out of cemeteries or anything like that. And I could just focus on the art and the task at hand and what I needed to do. And so I just spent the weekend just walking up and down the neighborhoods and getting stocked up, getting enough coffee for a couple weeks, and just getting fully prepared for this mission that I had. And so I ended up going to the mayor's office on Monday morning and I requested to film and photograph the cemeteries. And they gave me permission and told me if anybody runs me off, just come back and talk to them and they'll take care of it. And I said, all right. And so the first cemetery that I went and filmed and photographed in Ponce was the Cementerio La Playa. And it's right there, just like a 5-minute walk away from the ocean down there on the south coast. And it was a beautiful cemetery. It was pretty cool because all the walls, the concrete walls all the way around the cemetery, local artists over the years have painted different murals and stuff there. So it's really artful and really colorful. And then on the other side of those walls is the cemetery. And I spent all day walking around that cemetery, 4.5 to 6 hours, just taking pictures and videos. And I had lunch there at the cemetery and just walked up and down the rows. And everybody was cool with me that I ran into, although I didn't run into any people there to mourn their loved ones. It was just the people that were working there. But I told them that the mayor's office gave me permission and they were cool with it. And like I said, it just made everything way more comfortable. And that's when I realized that this was the strategy for looking at cemeteries. It wasn't being sneaky or anything like that and waiting to get caught. It was just going to the mayor's office straight up. after I got finished filming and photographing that cemetery, I put my focus on one of the main reasons that Ponce has always caught my eye, and that's their big civil cemetery there in the city. Their civil cemetery is huge. I would say 2 or 3 football fields long, and it's just continually goes uphill. And because of all the damage from the earthquakes and probably a lack of funding and various other reasons that I'm not even privy to, the cemetery has fallen in disarray over the years, and it's become overgrown, and there's some tombs that are completely covered by the jungle now. And like I said, this is just an absolutely huge cemetery, and I loved it. It's still to this day my favorite cemetery of all time. And I spent a good week, 7 to 10 days, um, of every day just getting up early in the morning and putting my clothes on and marching all the way across Ponce for a couple hours to get to that cemetery, and then spending hours there, and then marching a couple hours back home. And it became my routine for a while, and I'd usually drink about a gallon of water every day that I was in the cemetery at Ponce filming, because it was really hot and really dry, and I was climbing in bushes that were as high as me sometimes, and I had to put in a lot of work to do all the recording that I did. I think I got about 6 hours of footage total from that cemetery in Ponce, and it was a great couple weeks spending time there. And I remember going home every night and having some Victor Polo's chicken and pork, and then I'd get up in the morning and have a smoothie and make a cup of coffee and get a gallon of water, and then I'd march to the cemetery. And it was a great routine that really made me happy there for a while. The other cemetery in Ponce that I was really looking at for even a couple years before I went to Puerto Rico the first time was the Catholic cemetery in Ponce. And it's another giant cemetery that's a little overgrown in some parts, but they were actually doing a pretty good job at keeping it up. And I spent a couple days there before somebody even noticed me, because like I said, it was pretty empty. I didn't see any civilians there walking around at all. And there's just a lot of beautiful statues in that cemetery. A couple of the people that worked there came and sent me on my way. They sent me packing. I couldn't believe it. So I had to walk back to the mayor's office and tell them that I got thrown out. And I had somebody from the mayor's office call them and tell them that, it was okay for me to be there and to back off, so to speak. And so I got to walk back into the cemetery and spend a couple hours and finish up filming and photographing the cemetery. And I could tell the people that worked there weren't too happy about it, but I didn't mean no harm, and I was just minding my own business, and I didn't see a problem with what I was doing at all, especially because I was the only person there. It wasn't like I was bothering anybody or anything like that. And I ended up getting a lot of really good pictures from that cemetery, and you can see some of the episodes that I have on my YouTube channel about that cemetery if you go back and look deep enough in my YouTube channel. So at this point, I was about 3 weeks into my 1 month stay in Ponce, and throughout all the days of walking to the civil cemetery and the Catholic cemetery, which were completely on the other side of town from where I was staying, I was pretty intentional about walking to and from the cemeteries in a different way anytime I could, just so I would see different streets and different neighborhoods and stuff like that. And I ended up walking through almost every neighborhood in Ponce throughout that time. And because I got so much accomplished within the first 3 weeks, I decided one Friday morning to get up really early and walk to Juana Diaz. And it's this mountain town that's a little bit northeast of Ponce. And so I walked up to Juana Diaz early one morning. I mean, I left when it was still dark out. And I made it to Juana Diaz, and I went to the mayor's office, and I actually got to meet the mayor in Juana Diaz, and I got permission from them to film and photograph the cemetery there, and I spent all day filming and photographing the cemetery in Juana Diaz. It was an amazing, very well taken care of cemetery. I can't say that enough. So I got done filming and photographing the cemetery, and then on my way back, walking back to Ponce, I got hit with a big rainstorm. And it was a good rainstorm. I got caught in it for about 4 hours, and my only real concern was keeping my camera from getting wet, which I did, but I was completely soaked by the time I walked back into Ponce and then all the way across the city to get back to my apartment. And I'll never forget that. That was the wettest I ever was on the island of Puerto Rico. I was completely and absolutely soaked, and I had my camera in my backpack, and I had my backpack smashed into my shirt and my arms around my shirt. And that's what I had to do to keep my camera from getting wet, because I was going to save my camera at all costs. I had too much invested into it, and I put too much work into filming and recording all of those cemeteries, and I was not going to risk losing that data over a rainstorm. And then that weekend, I ended up going to the Pedro Campos Park, and I spent a good half of the day there. I've been looking at that park ever since I started researching Ponce and putting together everything that I wanted to do and see while I was there for a month. And the Pedro Campos Park was definitely on top of the list outside of the cemeteries. And it was an amazing little park, and I recommend anybody that goes to Ponce, they should go spend a couple hours there and walk around. It's a interesting area. And then I went and looked at a couple of murals and just walked up and down some more neighborhoods. And then I ran into a neighborhood that, for all intents and purposes, looked abandoned, and it was just full of stray dogs. And I've never seen so many stray dogs in one group before. There must have been 20, 25, maybe 30 of them. Luckily, they didn't really charge me or challenge me too much. They were a little docile. But when I first ran up on them, it definitely had my adrenaline going for a minute. And it seems to me the locals will just drive up there and dump some food on the road for them and whatnot. And that's kind of how they stay alive. And you know, there's probably a lot of interbreeding and all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on with those dogs in that abandoned neighborhood up there. But it was definitely a sight to behold, and I'll never forget it. And that's just one of the interesting things I ran into when I was walking up and down every neighborhood in Ponce, especially on the weekends when the cemeteries were closed. I would spend those days just doing other little side projects and exploring things. I was pretty disappointed that the Ponce Historical Museum was closed down, because it's still pretty damaged from the earthquake that they had recently. And that was really on the top of my list to go see that museum, but it wasn't in the cards this time. I spent my last week in Ponce after all that stuff was done, just kind of relaxing and focusing on the final 2 cemeteries that I wanted to go to before I had to leave Ponce. And the first cemetery of those 2 that I spent a whole day at was this, I call it the Castro Cemetery, and it's a real old historical cemetery right there in the middle of Ponce, and it is definitely one of their oldest, if not their oldest cemetery there, and it has a lot of prominent people that were buried there. It got so damaged by the earthquakes that they ended up having to move a lot of the bodies that were once interred there. And I think most of them just got buried in the Catholic cemetery or the civil cemetery. And when I went there, during my trip, they were at a state of reconstruction, and they were cleaning it up and trying to get the water fountain system working properly again. And something that I really liked about that cemetery and that really got my attention the most was the two people that were running it were younger people. And that's the first cemetery on the island that I saw that was being ran by younger people. And they just had a lot of energy and excitement about bringing that cemetery back. And they were just really cool and kind and gracious towards me. And I really appreciate how they treat the public at that cemetery. They did a really good job, and those two people definitely deserve a raise for the work that they're doing trying to make that cemetery awesome again. And it was definitely an interesting cemetery to see because most of the graves, or a lot of the graves, like I said, have been removed, and there's just a lot of like brick rubble that's left over. But right next to that are these like elegant pieces, so it's like destruction and just absolute perfection right next to each other. It was a interesting cemetery to spend the day at, to say the least. So I spent my last day in Ponce getting up early in the morning and marching to the mayor's office for the last time because there's this little barrio in Ponce called Coto Loro, and they had a really nice cemetery up there too that I wanted to film and photograph before I left. And so I got the permission and I marched out there and filmed and photographed it right before the rain, and luck was just on my side that day. I made it to Victor Polo's chicken stand and got my dinner, and I made it to my apartment right before a big rainstorm hit. And I spent the rest of the evening cleaning the apartment that I rented and getting ready and planning for what I was going to do next. And my original plan was to continue walking the East Coast all the way back up to San Juan from Ponce. I wanted to walk the Southeast Coast and the East Coast. But unfortunately, the morning that I stepped out of my apartment for the final time, there was a huge, giant rainstorm, and it turns out it was going to be storming like that in the area for the next 4 or 5 days. And it was one of those things, like I was telling you guys in part 1 of my second trip to Puerto Rico series, that sometimes on the island all your plans change in an instant. And because of all these storms that came in, and I was still on a budget, and I spent way too much in Ponce, but it was worth it. I had to completely redirect all my plans for the whole rest of my trip. And I'll get into that in the next episode. This is it for my Ponce episode. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you next time.